atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is historian Anthony Gregory. He's the author of multiple publications on national security, constitutionalism, and legal theory. His latest book is New Deal Law and Order, How the War on Crime Built a Modern Liberal State, which we'll be discussing today. Anthony Gregory, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be with you, Michael. I'm a big fan of the show.
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to talking with you. And as listeners know, I'm fascinated, maybe a little obsessed with the titles of books, but I think they mean a lot. And I do want to start, well, not with your title, but with your subtitle, because it's How the War on Crime Built a Modern Liberal State. And that phrase, war on crime, that's so very familiar to, I think, most listeners. But I'm wondering, did it start there in the New Deal era, or did it come before that, actually?
I'd say that it started in the New Deal era, but it really picked up traction a little bit before Roosevelt. Under his predecessor, President Herbert Hoover, they talked a little about a war on crime. This idea gained some traction in the press, among politicians, in trying to deal with the problems of the time, the last remnants of the Prohibition era, and racketeering and kidnapping. But it really took off under Roosevelt. He made it a more permanent fixture of American discourse and policy. And I'd say it never really went away. After the New Deal war on crime, we had the 60s and 70s war on crime, and then we had, I'd say the third wave of the war on crime in the 80s and 90s.
And so was this initial war on crime sort of prompted by prohibition and bootleggers and gangsters and that sort of thing? Is that where that comes from in your sense of things?
My sense is that it wasn't prohibition itself that produced a war on crime, at least not in a consistently, in a consistent sense in political discourse or policy discourse. What happened was when the Depression began, after the stock market crash, and the problems of prohibition continued, but seemed to be worsened by a new wave of kidnappings and the continuing and seemingly worsening problem of racketeering, and these, infamous bandits and these larger than life criminals like Bonnie and Clyde and the Barker gang and then John Dillinger in the early 30s, really more than the 20s. That's when there was this sense that it was time to mobilize against crime. And I would say that the memories of World War I and the new technological challenges of the automobile, that all of these factors converged to legitimate in many people's minds the need for an actual warlike posture toward crime that went beyond what was seen with alcohol prohibition.
And of course, crime was one problem that FDR had to deal with, but my gosh, there were plenty of other things. And so I'm wondering, to what extent, how big of a priority would you say crime was kind of overall in the grand scheme of things?
I would certainly be overstating it to say that crime was as big of a political crisis as the Depression. And if you lump together all of Roosevelt's, so-called economic policy, that those were the bulk of what he was known for before World War II, for good reason. But surprisingly, if you really, especially for those of us looking back, surprisingly, if you add up all of the problems of crime and corruption and lawlessness, if you look to the white supremacist violence in the South, lynching had declined in the late 20s, but it was rising up again in the early 30s. If you add that, and many Black Americans and civil rights activists did see that as part of the horror of crime, of lawlessness. There were problems of prison riots, right? And because of the corruption in the black markets caused by prohibition or worsened by prohibition, and the final loss of patience that Americans had for prohibition during the Depression, all of these things did add up. And just one example of how salient the issue of crime was, there was this movie that was in the theaters, Gabriel Over the White House, about a president who was basically a dictator. And he waged war against the fat cats. He did it for the sake of economic mobilization, but he also rounded up organized criminals, suspended Congress. He basically imposed martial law, and many Americans sought they sought these really illiberal, extreme approaches to this problem of crime. So it was a bigger issue than I'd say we remember.
Why I would expect that maybe regular Americans in 2024 and in recent times wouldn't know a lot about it. But I guess I'm a little bit surprised, having thought about the issue and having read your book, that it seems like a lot of historians sort of pushed the whole crime issue and what was done during this era to the periphery. I'm wondering why you think that is, or if I'm even right about that.
Well, I'd say that just in terms of, the scholarly side of this, the importance of the Depression and the New Deal and the importance of World War II, right, are hard to overstate.
Sure.
And the historians were, for generations, were understandably fixated on these huge problems of American history, these huge developments in American history. They were also right to focus on these issues of state development and political development when we look at the quantitative scope of what it meant for, federal outlays, what it meant for the number of people the government employed, and issues like that. In cultural terms and in social terms, the importance of crime and fighting crime in the 30s is something that the literature addresses, but not usually the New Deal literature. Alcatraz, which became a federal prison in 1934, that looms large in our cultural imagination. The modernization of the FBI, the beginning of the war on marijuana in the 1930s is something that many historians have long been aware of, but it's not really brought into conversation much with the New Deal historiography and narrative. And I think part of the explanation is, frankly, politics. I'd say that the politics of attributing a tough on crime stance to the great hero of modern liberalism, it doesn't really serve the more simple, kind of clean, popular narratives of either left or right. The conservatives don't want to credit Roosevelt for being tough on crime, certainly not the kind of revisionists among them. And I'd say a lot of more progressive historians wouldn't be the most sensitive to that type of story.
So let's talk about exactly what this war on crime looked like. And again, you devote a whole book to this, and so I'm asking you to condense down a lot, but can you sort of briefly sketch out kind of the broad approach that was taken to this war on crime in the New Deal era, and maybe how it differed from what came before it?
I would emphasize that the New Deal version of the war on crime was multifaceted, that it was truly strategically holistic and multi-pronged. This is to say that the New Dealers saw crime as a problem of social welfare. They saw crime as a problem of poverty, and poverty as a problem, and the economy is threatened by crime and the destruction caused by crime. They sought to bring together what I call the War on Crime Coalition. They sought to summon criminologists, progressive journalists, social workers, police at all levels of government, eventually the national security state. They bridged the political divide to do this. They bridged institutional divides. They saw every arm of government, every level of government, state, local, federal, as having a role in cooperation, even international governance in a sense. And they also saw crime and the war on crime as not just issues of welfare, but issues of security. And this lent itself to their overall holistic understanding of governance itself in the Roosevelt kind of New Deal state. So I would stress that. I'd also note that it was a more egalitarian and aspirational understanding. where they really thought that you could go after the forces of reaction. You could go after, white collar criminals, as they started to be called. And eventually, although it was not, as perhaps as satisfyingly rigorous in the beginning as we might hope, they also saw the problem of white supremacist violence as something that eventually did have to be addressed.
And one of the phrases in the book I love, you talk about the creative constitutionalism as part of the crime strategy, which to me sounds like a nice way of saying that, well, the administration sometimes played a little fast and loose with the Constitution when they needed to kind of reach certain policy goals. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what sort of constitutional liberties that were taken, or at least were considered, in the pursuit of this war on crime.
Well, so in 1934, the New Dealers established the largest slate of federal criminal law changes to date, about 20 major statutes. And many of these were done in the name of interstate commerce powers and interstate commerce regulation. I don't think we need to settle the question as to what the proper constitutional interpretations are, to acknowledge that they were just as innovative and expansive in their criminal justice powers as they were in regulating the economy or establishing social welfare programs. So this just coincided with the overall experimentalism and boldness of New Deal constitutionalism. Perhaps the most telling example of this is marijuana prohibition in 1937. So the federal government was able to ban alcohol by changing the Constitution explicitly with the 18th Amendment. And then they changed it with the 21st Amendment and legalized alcohol at the federal level again. They didn't change the Constitution explicitly to go after marijuana. And I would contend that the war on drugs that raged through the late 20th century and to a large degree to this day is just as constitutionally creative, let's say,
sure,
as these other New Deal programs. Now, at first, to go after narcotics and marijuana, they pressured the state governments to do it because they acknowledged the federal government had limited authority on its own. And they, in fact, would cite international treaty agreements as mandating the state. So that's very creative, too, citing international agreements to get state governments. But ultimately, the real innovation was just the assumption of this plenary general power to go after drugs.
And it seems to me that, well, one of the things that really fascinated me about the book, and I'd never really thought about before, is that if I'm understanding your argument right, is that the war on crime was in a way more than just a war on crime because it essentially paved the way for what you might call state building in a bunch of other areas. And so first off, am I right in taking that away from your book? And if so, can you sort of explain that connection to folks?
That's correct. That is important to my argument. It's also a somewhat kind of, this is where the interpretive work is perhaps a little bit hard to falsify, right?
Yeah.
When you talk about how different state projects relate to others, because a lot of this, it has to do with the culture of American liberalism and the ideology of Americans. What I basically contend is that law and order is in ways the very baseline set of powers that we expect from a government to have any legitimacy at all. If large swaths of the American population just don't trust and don't respect federal law and order, then the federal government can't become this robust welfare warfare state that it does in the 20th century. And indeed, from the Civil War, or certainly from Reconstruction all the way through Prohibition, the federal enforcement authority of its law enforcers is heavily distrusted and dismissed by huge swaths of the American population. We know the story with Prohibition. We see this in class warfare. We see this with racial politics, where both the white South and Black Americans see themselves as not being represented by federal enforcement authority for different reasons. And I argue that powerful New Deal coalition of organized labor, white Southerners, eventually Black Americans and others that all kind of come behind the major state building exercises of the mid 20th century. First, they had to have a baseline respect for American law and order. And I contend that the war on crime in the 30s is what consummated this respect.
And I guess it makes sense to me. Like I said, one of those things where once I read about it, I think, oh, of course, that if you're going to make an argument for an expanded, much more powerful federal government, what better grounds than to say, well, my gosh, one of the fundamental things that the government should do for us is make sure that we're safe in our homes and on the streets. And so that allows you to kind of get your nose in the door or under the tent, as it were, to kind of build from there then.
That's right. It's hard to imagine a modern taxation or regulatory regime or a widely trusted, legitimated national government of the kind that many celebrate that arises in the 20th century. It's hard to imagine that if when the federal marshals show up at your door, you just laugh at their face, right?
Yeah.
Which without the resources and without the cultural purchase that were achieved in the 30s, I think that we would have seen that problem continue more than it did throughout the later 20th century.
And I think when a lot of people think about the federal war on crime, they think about the FBI. And one of the big things, of course, that happened in this era was the creation of the modern FBI in 1935. And I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about how the FBI from that point onward differed from the Bureau of Investigation, which was what it was before that.
Well, so you're right. Part of this was this terminological change, which has a kind of a complicated history, but it does, for our purposes, conveniently mark this shift. The Bureau of Investigation becomes the FBI. The key substantive issue here is that in the 20s, the Bureau of Investigation was weak, it was controversial, it was both distrusted for being implicated in acts of repression and the kind of lawless repression going back to the Palmer raids and related issues like that, where J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the Bureau of Investigation, had some hand in that kind of repression. But it also, at the same time, just didn't have the investigatory or arrest powers or the manpower, or many of these agents weren't even armed. It was not the powerhouse that it would become. And it was the New Deal Justice Department, the attorneys general, Homer Cummings and Frank Murphy and Roosevelt himself, who encouraged the FBI and gave it more and more resources and the power to arrest and investigate, and encouraged its cooperation with state and local governments, and elevated it all the way to be one of the trio of major intelligence agencies on the eve of World War II, along with like the Office of Naval Intelligence. I mean, it was really up there with hemispheric reach. The development of the FBI from what it was, including the controversial and weak status it had, all the way to this huge influence it carried by the time you get to World War II, it's hard to think of another agency of the American government that transformed quite that much. And I know that's saying a lot because the 30s were important, right, for the development of government power in general.
I think a lot of people would see that transformation of the Bureau of Investigation into the FBI and see it as too much, because I know a lot of folks on the left, when they think about the early history, well, the first, 3 or 4 decades of the FBI, they think of J. Edgar Hoover as this anti-leftist guy who held massive amounts of power and could, some would say, bend presidents to his will because of his secret files and all that sort of thing, ruining a lot of people's lives, and saying that this is why we don't want this super powerful federal law enforcement, because it's going to be weaponized against enemies of whoever happens to be in power. Am I being too harsh on J. Edgar Hoover here?
I think that all of those impressions and interpretations are deserving of their place in how we remember the FBI. But there is a more nuanced way of looking at it. There's this this huge, impressive, and very important book, probably the definitive book on J. Edgar Hoover by Beverly Gage that came out recently, G-Man. And it rigorously explains everything that you just laid out. At the same time, while J. Edgar Hoover was, we might say, right-wing, he did also assist in the investigations of lynching and police brutality. He helped to bust white supremacist organizations and organized crime. And indeed, a lot of his domestic surveillance powers and his crime-fighting powers were not ones that he was that interested in adopting. It wasn't he was more of like a technocrat. He wanted to do fingerprinting and stuff like that. But it was the Roosevelt administration and the Attorney General Homer Cummings who really encouraged Hoover to like arm his people and to go after crime and to expand domestic surveillance for political reasons. One last irony I'll note, though, of course, is that in recent years, the politics surrounding interpretations of the FBI have been scrambled quite a bit.
Yeah.
In the Trump era, which I think we kind of still live under, and which probably began before he was president, a lot of liberals started to see the FBI as this great bulwark of democracy, and a lot of right-wingers have seen the FBI as this menace. And that interpretation on both sides, I think, has to some degree served to retcon and to kind of retroactively change the way they look at the deeper past. And so you'll see some people on the right, I think we saw Vivek Ramaswamy condemn the fact that they still admire J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. And this is quite interesting, seeing this scramble. So I don't want to make too big a point of that, but I think it is notable.
Let's move from somebody that probably everyone's heard of, J. Edgar Hoover, to someone that almost no one has heard of, who you've mentioned a few times, who was very important in this, and that is Homer Cummings. I'll admit, I thought I knew a fair amount about this era, but the name was not all that familiar to me. So can you talk a little bit about this man who at one point you say his approach to transforming legal authority helped to redefine liberalism? That's a pretty big deal.
It is, yeah. Well, thanks for picking up on one of my boldest statements. Well, as many historians and others acknowledge, Roosevelt himself sought to redefine liberalism. He saw himself as within the great tradition of liberalism, but he thought it needed to be updated to accommodate more social state power, right? And Homer Cummings was fully on board with this and gave speeches about liberalism and the history of liberalism and the inadequacy of classical liberalism to the current moment. And he similarly saw the need for the transformation of American legal institutions in this development of American statecraft. And he saw the ideological and institutional trajectory as linked. He saw himself in these historical terms, that here we are, it's the 1930s, we have new needs, we can't abandon our democratic traditions or our liberal traditions or our constitutional traditions, but we need to change them. We need to adapt them to the current moment. And he was a key legal thinker for both New Deal constitutionalism and the war on crime, as well as a stalwart New Dealer. He was as invested in the New Deal's social programs as he was the war on crime, and he saw them as deeply linked, and he saw them all as part of the transformation of liberalism and the constitutional order.
Let's turn to talk about the people who were not all that crazy about what FDR and Homer Cummings and the crew were trying to do, how they were trying to transform federal crime fighting. Who were these people? I mean, can you broadly characterize the groups that were not all that crazy about these changes and why they weren't very happy about what was going on?
Well, one of the remarkable features of this story, and it might help explain why it's doesn't get more traction, in our popular memory or even the scholarship, is there wasn't that much dissent somehow Roosevelt's war on crime played on this ecumenical vision of law and order versus lawlessness, where almost all facets of American society saw themselves as having a part to play insofar as they were invested in these questions at all. And so conservatives, legal thinkers who opposed New Deal economics tended to agree with the Roosevelt administration about the need to, say, streamline criminal procedure and make it easier to put people in prison, to give prosecutors more power. There were, on the margins, some people of note that were a little bit less enthusiastic about aspects of the war on crime. Like, Roger Baldwin of the American Civil Liberties Union, he doesn't seem totally thrilled with it. But he's suspicious of New Deal state power in general, actually, because organized labor had been suspicious of state power. But he actually comes to embrace the potential of the Justice Department to go after anti-labor vigilantes and to be a force for a new kind of liberalism. One of the major examples of disagreement was what to do about lynching, of course. Key to the New Deal coalition, the Jim Crow Democrats in the South, even those who saw lynching as something local enforcement should try to keep under wraps, they didn't want federal encroachment. But Roosevelt dealt with that by more or less not giving in to them and somehow keeping an increasing number of Black Americans in the NAACP in support of him by doing other things to gesture toward cracking down on white supremacist violence. So it was the way the war on crime developed, because there was a lot of uncertainty about the future. It was only on the margins that you see dissent. Like, for example, when they first went to regulate firearms in 1934, there were, sportsman groups and other advocates who said, we can't go as far as Homer Cummings wants to go. But then the Roosevelt administration kind of found a middle ground, and it postured as being not quite authoritarian, but also not laissez-faire. And maybe there's more examples of dissent that I haven't come across, and maybe that'd make another good book, but I didn't find much.
I guess I'm thinking about this in part from a modern standpoint where you can't turn on a crime show without the local cops saying, oh my God, the FBI is coming in and taking over our investigation. These federal folks don't know what they're doing, and they should just leave law enforcement to us. We know our communities and that sort of thing, and they're just parachuting in. And that sort of thing, I guess. And especially, I would think back in a time when the notion of state authority and federalism was far stronger than one would expect it to be today. It almost strikes me as odd that there wasn't more of a pushback from those sort of folks. Well,
I understand that mystery there. During Prohibition, I argue that what we see is a little bit of a reversal of the traditional adversarial relationship between different jurisdictions where they're competing for authority. During Prohibition, it was more of a matter of federal and state authorities dodging responsibility for failing to enforce alcohol prohibition effectively, right? Everyone was pointing their fingers. And so somehow by the time we get to the 30s and the New Deal, there is a little bit of jealousy. But what happens is the state governments and the local police are given access to, say, the fingerprinting database. So they all start to become more and more enamored of J. Edgar Hoover. It's the New Deal that resolves that zero-sum or negative-sum game of federalism and creates a cooperative approach where almost everyone sees a potential for their own power to expand and for themselves to be respected, where the federal government actually looks to them as the states and localities as laboratories to learn from. There are examples where, say, the state of Alabama's officials, some of them were suspicious of federal drug authority. And when you think about that in retrospect, it's funny because when we think of the later 20th century, we don't really think of the war on drugs as one of the main issues of conservative states' rights, contestation, right? So I think you're right that this is kind of a quirk of the era.
So whenever I used to talk to students about public policy changes, I always said that the question it's never a case where a policy or a set of policies is 100% successful. There are always things that go wrong. There are always unintended consequences. And sometimes it takes a while for them to show up. Now, of course, the New Deal is almost a century ago. Not quite, but it's getting to that point. And so given the benefit of hindsight, when you look back at these policies, I mean, what do you see as the big net gains, and maybe the things that the ways in which the administration missed the boat or took a wrong turn or something like that?
Well, the main purpose of the book is neither vindicatory nor condemnatory. It's more of just a genealogy of state building, right? But I do have opinions. I think that in the longer term, the expansion of the carceral state ended up being something of a humanitarian disaster. I'd say the expansion of the security state, that some of the things you kind of hinted at, the Bureau of Investigation did prove to be a menace to civil liberties in the 20th century. One of the stories I wrap into all of this when I get into World War II is, of course, Japanese internment, which certainly in the moments was one of the great injustices, right, of the domestic security state of American wartime. And I'd say, in particular, the war on marijuana, which ended up kind of blooming into a full-blown war on drugs in the later 20th century, was one of the great domestic cataclysms. It was overall harmful. But I'm also, reluctant to say that there's this unbroken path, right, between the early war on crime in the 30s and all of the excesses that followed. But certainly there have been a lot of Americans hurt by criminal justice policy, and I think that in many ways it has distorted and deformed the constitutional order as well.
Because I think a lot of us on the left think about law enforcement and we're concerned about racial disparities. And of course, all this happened, a couple generations before the civil rights movement. And so I guess one thing I was wondering about is, to what extent were administration officials who were planning these changes concerned about the sort of effects that these things would have on minorities?
Well, one of the more general issues in play here, of course, was still in the period of Jim Crow, which at least indirectly structured much of American society and very much directly affected all of the former Confederate states, right? And the Roosevelt administration was aware of this, and Roosevelt himself had to placate and was not, nearly as vigilant as probably most of us would wish that he had been in checking these impulses. And they knew that there was this just general understanding that to be tough on crime would have certain racial disparities. And, on the margins, you could see, the Justice Department did this report on prisons throughout the country, and they were interested in the disparities. And they were a little bit interested in parole and probation, which they sought to defend because they were rehabilitationists. They believed both in expanding prisons and in expanding rehabilitation, multifaceted, right? But they were aware of this. But in some ways, like in some of the more quantifiable ways, the disparities, say, in the prison population weren't as pronounced as they eventually would become. And it's a very complicated story what the specific New Deal criminal justice policies did to these disparities. In some ways, things got a little worse. In some ways, things got a little more equal. But it really wasn't until later in the century that, say, in the prison system at least, that the disparities became nearly as scandalous as they would. So it's It's a very good question, and it's not actually a simple answer.
You know, and I think some people might have a narrative that goes something like this. In the New Deal era, the Roosevelt administration created this far more powerful federal police surveillance state. And then a generation or two later, that was used to actively work against the civil rights movement. And well, what do you think about that sort of narrative? Is there a certain amount of truth in that, or maybe more broadly, how do you feel that the creation of this war on crime maybe affected how the civil rights movement came about and how it developed?
I'd say that's a totally legitimate narrative, but like all such narratives, it's not fully complete. The Bureau of Investigation and other arms of the security state and security force of the United States surveilled and spied on the kind of the Black activists and others involved in the early, in the anticipation of the civil rights movement. If we count the civil rights era as having a longer history going back to, say, World War I, J. Edgar Hoover was suspicious of these people throughout. Certainly, we see how the Roosevelt administration's surveillance of Japanese Americans, including in Hawaii, that there was certainly a racism to how the security state was functioning well before the classical 1950s, 60s civil rights era. I think what happens in the 50s and 60s is that if we're going to simplify the story in terms of like white reaction and Black liberation, these two strains in American politics had somehow been reconciled during the New Deal, right? Two of the most important factions to the New Deal coalition were white Southerners and eventually Black Americans. And they held out different hopes about what the future of law and order and the security state would look like. And Roosevelt, in his adept political maneuvering, was able to gesture toward both factions and encourage them in their hopes. I think what we see in the 50s and especially the 60s is, just as with other questions of this coalition, that no longer can these conflicting hopes about the future be reconciled. So the 60s and 70s unraveling of the New Deal coalition and the New Deal order is, to a large degree, a recognition that the contradictions of the New Deal coalition could no longer be sustained. And I'd say that law and order and its relationship to civil rights is one of the most neglected facets of both the construction of the New Deal order and its unraveling.
One thing we haven't talked about to this point really is the media. Of course, today, when we think about the media and law enforcement, well, federal law enforcement gets it on both sides. I mean, on the left, there's the concern about incarceration rates and inequality, racial inequalities in that. And then on the right, you have these concerns about the FBI, federal law enforcement, being weaponized against political opponents. And so I'm wondering, what was the media reaction to all this back in the day when this whole war on crime was just being started in the New Deal era?
Most of the media, most of the press was enamored of the war on crime. They romanticized law enforcement as well as the local, state, and federal politicians who are waging wars on crime. And the war on crime was a bipartisan affair. What Roosevelt was able to do, as with other things, was he was able to brand the war on crime as simultaneously a partisan project and just a logical, down the road American project. Right? He did this with most of his agenda, and it's one reason he was such a revolutionary president for both the country and his party. And the war on crime was no exception. So Republicans waged the war on crime. In New York State, we had Roosevelt as governor before he was president, then his successor, Herbert Lehman, and then his successor, Thomas Dewey, who was a Republican. And all three of these governors were known for waging wars on crime. And the press didn't, in general, see the war on crime, at least in broad strokes, as that controversial an issue. it was probably one of the least major controversial initiatives of the decade.
I think a lot of folks from the standpoint of 2024 would look back and think, well, this is interesting historically, but what's the real modern day relevance or resonance of that? I know that, and I think there is some, but what would you say to those folks who say, well, yeah, that's just old stuff that happened. It doesn't really matter to today. Oh, what would you say are the main modern day consequences or main relevance of what was done back then?
Well, one formulation that I advance in the book is that Roosevelt built law and order. He built American law and order, both in the narrow sense and the broad sense. He built it in the narrow sense of, revamping criminal justice and law enforcement policy in very significant ways. But this related to the broader project of building law and order in this more general way of stabilizing and legitimating American government authority. And the long-term significance of this is today, I think we're seeing a lot of fracture and a lot of suspicion and polarization in American society, where public institutions in general are deeply distrusted, and there's a cynicism on left and right. And a lot of this cynicism has to do with institutions of law and order. And it's all kind of a scramble, right? As we mentioned, the right wing now distrusts the FBI and now probably the Secret Service. The left has a much more distrust for local police than the right does, and maybe immigration enforcement. And I would note that the general sense of suspicion and distrust that we're living through, which seems to be an even worse version than, say, the early 21st century, during the war on terror, and maybe more reminiscent of some things we saw in the 60s and 70s, if not worse, that this suspicion of law enforcement and the suspicion of American governance or the political project of American democracy in general, that they're linked. And when we wonder today more generally about the kind of existential crisis of the American Republic, just to, be humble about the stakes of my project here, right? When we're looking at that and saying, how do we get that legitimacy back? What we have to look to is, how was that legitimacy built in the first place? And so I think that the New Deal order, including law and order, are an important part of that story.
And I wonder if today the challenge isn't even greater, because it seems to me that back then they weren't exactly starting from a clean slate, but they were trying to build up a clearly under-resourced agency in the FBI and just general federal law enforcement and crime fighting, whereas today that's certainly not the issue. And so the challenges seem to me that maybe even greater today in certain ways than they were back in FDR's time. And I wonder what you think about that.
I think you're right. It makes me uncomfortable to want to agree with you on this, right? But I think that what we're seeing, there's never a perfect parallel in history, but this general distrust and this fear of lawlessness and this fear of both law enforcement and weaponization of law enforcement and this fear of crime on both sides does remind me of the period between the Gilded Age and, say, Prohibition, more than anything since World War II. But on top of that, you're right. We already have this Leviathan state, right? And you can't really gain trust simply by increasing the scope of police, right? It's not the distrust of law enforcement seems much more difficult. There are fewer low-hanging fruit than there were in the 30s for the government to try to step up and work towards. So I share your short-term pessimism.
Well, and that said, and of course, not only are the circumstances maybe more challenging, FDR was a generational, more than that, maybe once in a lifetime sort of political talent. And so, but putting that aside, they're pretty big things to put aside. Looking back to that era and the decisions that were made, do you see anything from back there that maybe modern day, almost certainly less talented, more challenged politicians can look back from and maybe draw from in a way that might help with federal law enforcement today?
Well, surely. I think we can learn a lot. And I think there are some positive models. I'd say that Roosevelt came in finally promising an end to alcohol prohibition. Now, what's sometimes forgotten is alcohol prohibition was a response to a very real problem. You know, the American alcoholism and abuse around alcohol really was a social problem, but the solution was worse than the problem. And I'm hoping that in thinking of reforming drug laws today, and in thinking of the temptation to deal with, you know, the opiate crisis today, that there's a more practical and humane approach than, say, the 1980s war on drugs. And I think that you can get that by looking at some, if not all, of the Roosevelt administration's lessons there. We could learn the lesson, don't legalize one thing just to start another drug war like they did with marijuana.
Yeah.
And the other positive thing that I would point to is this vision of law and order being more inclusive, that it means that vigilantism is bad, that nativist vigilantes beating up immigrants is bad, that it means, strike breakers beating up workers is bad, that it means that lynching is bad. That, any approach to dealing with lawlessness that empowers the state carries certain risks with it. But I do think in the long term, all policies should, and the very project of politics should aim toward this inclusive universalism that at its best, though certainly not consistently, the New Dealers did have a sense of compared to generations that came before them.
Yeah. All right, well, on that note, I think we will close. And I just want to say, as we do close, that I read a lot of books on American politics and political history. And generally speaking, I don't learn that much that's new or that much that kind of changes how I look at things. But this New Deal loaner was an exception to that. And so I am happy to very enthusiastically recommend it to listeners. And Anthony Gregory, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Michael. It was quite an honor to be on your show. Thank you so much. And thanks for that endorsement.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling, knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,